One day, you or someone you care about is going to need a poem. They're going to need a poem for inspiration, maybe for healing, perhaps for some new insight, but they're going to need a poem. And maybe they just need to remember what the most powerful part of themselves feels and looks like. Maybe they need to have access to their strength and their joy, the very kinds of things that a poem often does better than anything else. So, what I want you to be able to do, whether you need it for yourself or you need it for another person, I want you to be able to deliver that poem, to speak it in a way that's going to have the greatest chance of really doing the very thing that you want it to do. And if it's another person that is involved, that they want that poem to do. So we're going to talk about how can you speak a poem that changes the world, maybe one person at a time, but that definitely changes the world. A poem, how can you read a poem, perform a poem in a way that relaxes the mind and allows the heart to listen more fully? Again, maybe your heart, maybe another person's heart. And all that means, that kind of question about poetry and about reading poetry in skillful ways, means that you are listening to Poetry, Gossip, and the Pursuit of Pleasure with your host, Dale Biron. That's me. And in this podcast, as I say, each week we explore all the practical ways that poetry can help us in our everyday lives, finding little pockets of joy, sanity, and connectedness. Now, I want to set the context a little bit for this week's episode because it's a little different. I've never done a talk or an episode on this podcast about the way that we actually deliver poetry for the poem to make the or have the greatest opportunity to land in the heart, to land in the mind, to motivate us, inspire us, heal us in the ways that we most want. Usually I'm talking about the poems themselves, and we're going to talk about that today because, of course, it helps tremendously. It's critical to start with the right poem. But today, in this episode, we're going to focus on some very straightforward and I think simple principles that each of us can use more often to make sure that the impact of the poems that we love and that others perhaps can be helped by to increase the healing impact and the insightful and inspiring impact of those poems. So, I was thinking that the idea of being a poem whisperer, I love that idea. And that occurred to me in putting this together. Um, so, um, one of the greatest, as I was thinking about putting this together, and again, I've never done a presentation on this or certainly not a podcast. I thought to myself that over the years, over teaching, by this time, thousands of people in classes and workshops and all manner of ways of getting together with people around poetry, one of the greatest compliments that I've ever received in this work is having someone say that when they listened to a poem, when they went back to read a poem that they had discovered oftentimes or rediscovered in one of the workshops or classes or talks that I have done, that they would actually hear my voice as they read the poem, and they said that it was helpful. That's a very high compliment to me. But rather than make it about some personal thing, because I usually tell people that, look, the poetry's doing the work, and I'm just showing up with the poems. However, as I've already said, I do believe the way that we deliver the poems to ourselves and to others really makes a difference on the impact. And so that's why I want to focus on these, what I'm calling poem whispering principles. And we'll get to those in just a minute because I've got a number of them that I want to talk to you that I've really honed over the last 30 years or so. But I want to start today. I want to start with the very first poem that I ever memorized. It's a little Emily Dickinson short little poem called A Word is Dead. And it is a poem that we can play with a little bit. And then I want to talk to you about these principles of being a poem whisperer. A word is dead. A word is dead. A word is dead when it is said. Some say, some say, I say, a word just begins to live that day. A word is dead when it is said. When it is said, some say, I say, I say. A word just begins to live that day. Now, I want to tell you a little story about that poem. Many years ago, I was in a program very similar to Poets in the Schools, if you may have heard of that. This was one that was done in, locally with the Poetry Society that I belonged to and was on the board of and participated in working with high school and junior high school students. And I remember being in a classroom and just feeling like I was really, in a difficult situation. Didn't feel like I was connecting with the class. It just, I don't know, just one of those days. And I decided to ask the young folks, the young people in that class, I decided to ask them if what was the consequences of being someone who does not keep their word. And I just asked that question. And people had a few comments to make, and they were warming up a little bit and opening up a little bit. And then I read this poem. A word is dead. A word is dead when it is said. Some say, I say, I say. A word just begins to live that day. Now, there's many ways to walk inside that poem, but one way is to talk about that it is talking about integrity. But we want to focus, as I've already said, not so much on the meaning or not only on the meaning, but we want to focus on how to speak these poems so that they have the maximum opportunity to do their thing, to as I often say, to fly under the radar screen of the strategic mind directly to the heart. And I think the music of our voices can often do that as well as anything. So, poem whispering principles, I promised that I was going to do them. And so let me just I've got 6 of them. And let me just say them, and then we'll talk a little bit about each one, and I'll give you a couple of other examples, because my real purpose is to have each of us be able to take some or part of these things I'm going to say and to be able to improve how much you're able to present poems to yourself so that you love them even more. And speaking of that, that gets right to the first principle. Principle number 1, if you love a poem, own it. If you love a poem, own it. A loving voice is your best tool for that poem. If you love a poem, own it. Number 2, always read with a skosh, just a little skosh of liveliness. Vary the poem. No monotone. Monotone puts people to sleep. It takes a piece of art. It's almost like we were going to look at a Van Gogh from 2 miles away through a haze. A monotone spoken poems don't showcase the poem. So always read with a skosh of liveliness. Number 3, repeat a line if it begs to go again. Repeat a line if it insists, if that line of poetry insists that it needs to go again, then read it again. And this is for a diversity of ears, because you're going to have different people listening to you. And on different days, we even listen differently than we do on others. Number 4, go with the flow. In other words, read the poem not too fast or not too slow. Just go with the flow. Let the feelings in. Sometimes if we go too fast, we go so fast that the heart does not have time to catch up. Go with the flow, not too fast, not too slow. Number 5, feature the punchline. One of my great mentors, William Stafford, said, poems are just serious jokes. I've always loved that because I don't like this rarefied idea of poetry. If you've listened to this podcast, you know I'm talking about poems for the rest of us, poems for the people, not poems locked away in some hothouse literature class. Although, I'm sure there's a lot of great literature classes, but not those kind of poems, not poems you're forced to read or forced to analyze, poems that you love. Feature the punchline, serious jokes. That's what poems are. And the best poems, at least for me, have some kind of surprise ending. So feature that. The last of these poem whisperer principles, or how to speak a poem that changes the world, is invite silence into your speaking, literal and imaginative. Invite more silence. So, as I've said, we have to let the words be our guide. Then you'll know which of the guidelines wants to come forward, maybe a little bit more, maybe 1 or 2 of them in particular, maybe all of them, but don't force anything. I always say about poems, if a poem doesn't want to do something, you can't stop it from not doing it. But if it wants to do something, you can't stop that either. What we want to do is these whispering principles, or these principles about how to speak a poem more skillfully, they are loving nudges. They're not mechanical techniques. So remember that poem we just said, a word is dead. A word is dead when it is said. Some say, I say, a word just begins to live that day. Now, you might notice that even in those 2, I call them sometimes reciting. Don't use that word, please. Don't ever say you're going to recite a poem. People will immediately go to sleep. But when you speak a poem, when you perform a poem, oftentimes you'll do it differently, a little differently each time. That's okay, because the poem is connecting with your own heart, and then you are connecting it to the world. That's all okay. And I think that makes sense. And so if you notice that I did repeat a few lines, I slowed down, I varied the volume, all those things will help have that poem, just right there in the sweet spot. There's another, speaking of Emily Dickinson and speaking of presenting poems in a way that helps them land deeper. There's a poem called Wild Nights that she wrote. It's an interesting poem from Emily Dickinson, because everybody thought she was this prim and proper woman and this, that, and the other. And then she writes this poem. Wild nights, wild nights, wild nights. Were I with thee, wild nights should be our luxury. Rowing in Eden, rowing in Eden, the sea. Might I moor tonight in thee? There's old Emily, wild nights. Now, again, I want to say this emphatically. I have got no pipeline to the truth when it comes to how to speak a poem. I have just playfully worked with poems and worked with how I presented poems, performed poems, spoke poems to a lot of different people over the years, and tried to make my reading. This is where these 6 guidelines go. Try to make it more responsive to the listening ear of those that I presented poems to. That's where these came from. They came from very practical ways. But I want to say that you can experiment with all of this. You can experiment with all of this, and I hope you will, because again, there's none of us, just like there's no one way to, analyze a poem. The poem means what it means in your body, how it feels in your body. So you will speak it that way too, or at least I hope you will. Um, so I just realized that that I left out one of the verses. Okay, this is good. This poem is going to even be better now because we're going to have the complete the complete poem. Um, it's the Wild Nights poem. I left out a verse. Wild nights, wild nights. Say it with a little gusto. Were I with thee, wild nights should be our luxury. Futile the winds to a heart in port. Futile the winds to a heart in port. Done with the compass, done with the chart. Rowing in Eden. Ah, the sea. Might I moor tonight in thee. So again, I don't suggest that you leave out parts of the poem, but play with it, have fun, vary the pace, vary the speed, the repetition. What works? I was thinking if stories are the DNA of human change, and oh, Lord knows there's so many things. If you think about the ecological challenges, the Earth overshoot challenges, the social challenges, the challenges politically, and with a war raging in Ukraine. I mean, there's human change that we need to step into, and stories are the DNA of that change. So the better that we can tell stories, the better we can help each other change, starting with ourselves. Because remember what I've said on this podcast so many times before, poems are just stories without the boring parts. Okay. So let's go to another poem. And this is a totally different poem than we've been playing with so far from these Emily Dickinson poems. But let's apply the same poem principles, poem speaking, poem whispering principles, if we can. This is a poem that I wrote many years ago, and it was a poem that was written after my mother died many years ago. My mother died in her early 60s, quite young, and as you would imagine, my father was impacted deeply for a long time. And so he used to find signs from her all the time. He would report those signs to us. Now, of course, I've lived far away from where I grew up, but he and I would talk quite frequently, and he would consistently tell me that he found some new sign that my mom, his wife, had left for him. And so after hearing about this over a number of years, this is the poem that cohered one morning as I did my writing. And I called it simply Signs. Signs. Goes like this. After mom died, a lot of things changed around here. Dad became a gifted reader of signs, each one forged from her to him, each one placed with care on his daily walks. Diverse omens found lying on the ground, pregnant with a type of urging and purpose. She would forgive him for things he felt needed forgiving, and she would tell him things too Once she left a penny, weathered deceptively green by neglect, and with that year she died. At other times, she would remind him to be good, to eat well, to make long distance calls on holidays. Through other improbable messengers, like old postcards, broken pieces of jewelry, even old tools and lost gas caps. Each had a portion of the story to tell and tell again. For years now, he has walked that same path daily, while the signs have ebbed and flowed with the attentive muscle of his grieving. Hunger will always speed the plow. Hunger will always speed the plow. For years now, he has walked that same path daily, while the signs have ebbed and flowed with the attentive muscle of his grieving. Hunger will always speed the plow. Hunger will always speed the plow. Now, when I wrote that poem, many years ago, you can tell it's dated in one sense when I talked about, that long distance calls is a big deal. Now, long distance calls are not a big deal. I mean, it's still wonderful to get a call from someone, but as a child, I remember that they were so expensive that, on holidays, people, you pass the phone around, and you did that quickly because it was expensive. Anyway, so in that poem, there's a way in which sometimes there's a little bit of a pregnant pause that the poem calls for. Sometimes, as I mentioned, there's a repeating of a line. Sometimes the voice needs to vary and get really quiet so that you can come back and make a dynamic instrument out of the voice, which helps the words fly under the radar screen, as we've said, of the strategic mind and directly to the heart. And, I've often said on this podcast, I love the line Ezra Pound said. He said, if the poet, as the poet's writing a poem, if the poet is not surprised, the reader will not be either. And I found when I was writing this poem years ago, I still remember quite vividly as that last line came to me, hunger will always speed the plow. So in times of deeper grieving, I noticed that my father found more signs. He needed more signs, and he found them. He found them. And so, yes, so the presenting of a poem is matched. The words will ask for what they need, and you can play with it. It's no right or wrong here. Just play with it. And I also want to reiterate that if you pick the right poem for the situation, it will do much of the heavy lifting. And then if you speak the poem well, if you present it well, if you say it well, if you become a poem whisperer, as we're saying, then surely you will even have that medicine, that inspiration, that healing medicine, that insightful medicine, that you are not alone kind of medicine, which so many poems do. You are not alone. It's a comforting feeling, especially in grieving, as this poem is really talking about the grieving of one man for his wife and all of the ins and outs, the day-to-day things about that grieving. So I want to move on to a poem which is really different. All these poems are really different today, but the last poem we're going to do, again, we're talking about how to speak poems, how to present poems, how to say them just for ourselves. You know, one of the things that occurred to me, think back when you were, let's say, a teenager, the first music, the first songs that you fell in love with. And it's likely because they reminded you of some love that was either totally important to you or unrequited or whatever it was. It was breaking your heart or blowing your heart wide open, whatever it was doing. You were also falling in love with songs. Most everybody has had that experience. Now, if you think about that, you know, songs are just, you know, they're poems put to music. I mean, obviously it's different, but it's in the same category. Songs rhyme with poetry. You know, with poetry, you're just using the music is of your voice alone, typically without instruments. But the idea is that that with songs, you didn't read the song, you sang the song. You know, whether it's in the shower or wherever it was, and maybe you know, you didn't think your voice was that great. You know, we're all pretty self-critical about stuff like that. But the point is that you sang it, you did it with gusto, you did it with timing, like the musicians that you loved. So this is really the kind of thing I'm talking about. Only in this case, with a poem, you get to make it your own. You love it, so step into it and make it your own. So let's try to make this one our own. See if you like this one. It's a poem by the great German poet Rilke, and the translation is by the brilliant, brilliant poet who we just lost about 4 or 5 years ago. Yes, about that amount of time. Robert Bly. Translation by Robert Bly. This poem is called Solid Rock. Let's give it a try. Give it a whirl, shall we? It is possible. It is possible that I am pushing through solid rock in flint like layers as the ore lies alone. I am such a long way in, I can see no way through and no space. Everything is close to my face, and everything close to my face is stone, is stone. I don't have much knowledge yet in grief, so this darkness makes me feel small. You be the master. You be the master. Make yourself fierce, break in. Then your great transforming will happen to me, and my great grief cry will happen to you. Solid Rock by Rilke. Translation Robert Bly. Last stanza. I don't have much knowledge yet in grief. I don't have much knowledge yet in grief. So this darkness makes me feel small. You be the master. You be the master. Make yourself fierce. Break in. Then your great transforming will happen to me, and my great grief cry will happen to you. Now, on one level, this would be an amazing poem to speak to yourself if you were going through a bout of depression. Because on one level, I walk inside this poem, and the experience I have is that it's an amazing description of what depression feels like, solid rock all around our face. And where maybe the only thing we have to give is our grief cry. And this poem says to us in a loving way, that's okay. That's all you need to give, your grief cry. If that's all you have, that's what you give. And then you're perhaps on your way to healing. So when I read that poem, again, I've got no pipeline to the truth. This is my way of reading it. This is my way of, owning the poem, reading it with a bit of liveliness, repeating a line or two. If the line says, repeat me, go with the flow, not too fast, not too slow. Feature the punchline. Feature the punchline. For me, this poem is just so obvious because it says at the end, all you have to give, if all you have to give is your grief cry, that is enough. Oh, what a delicious, inclusive, forgiving, empathetic punchline to this poem. So you don't want to, you want to feature it. And you also want to invite silence into your speaking. And a poet like Rilke, to me, wrote with great silence in his poetry, with kind of a pensive kind of concentration and silence built in to the words. One of the reasons I love his poems so much. And you can these principles of how do you present a poem, even short little ditties like this. I've always loved this. Rumi said it like this: "Raise your words, not voice. It is rain that grows flowers, not thunder." I used to say, we used to say about my dad, he's a carrier of ulcers. He doesn't have them. uh, and this would have been a great poem when I was a kid. Raise your words, not your voice. It is rain that grows flowers, not thunder. Yeah. Well, what I've learned is, and I think in my dad's case, that when he was feeling insecure, he thundered sometimes. And we all do that to some degree. So that takes us almost to the barn. I hope these principles that I'm talking about, I hope they help. And I'm going to put these probably in the notes on the YouTube version of the podcast. So if you want to take a look at them, you can. And I'd love to hear your experience using these if you are so inspired to do that. Because I really feel like that if we can read a poem well, we can change the world, perhaps one person at a time, starting with ourselves. And the note that I made for myself is, let the music of your voice, its cadence, rhythms, and timing, carry the meaning of poems that you love and that you think others may love, deep into your heart and deep into other hearts, the hearts that you are speaking to when you bring the gift of poetry. Or, as we can say, not rarefied, just the gift of poems without the boring parts. Because it's going to be stories that changes the world, stories that change us. We need the best ones, and we need to study, I think, a little bit how to deliver those stories, those poems, in the most delicious, heart-affecting, loving, forgiveness-giving ways that we can. So read a poem well, and you can change the world, yours and others. Be a poem whisperer. Okay, that is a final wrap. So, as I always say, thank you so much for your listening ear. if you have learned something or felt a little bit of inspiration from this podcast, give a like down there, refer it to other people, make a comment. Everything helps, or those kinds of things help to get the word out so that more people who love poetry, more people who love stories without the boring parts, so that they can find what they need. So until next time and next poems, take good care of yourself.